Let me tell you about a woman named Marisol Quintero. The summer of 1989 had already settled hard over the high desert of southeastern Arizona when she first understood that the world had decided her family's land was in the way. She was 34 years old, the third generation to stand on the dry caliche soil at the foot of the Chiricahua Mountains, near a small railroad town called Bowie that most people on Interstate 10 drove past without ever slowing down. Her grandfather, Don Esteban Quintero, had crossed up from the Mexican state of Sonora during the troubles of the 1930s, on foot, with almost nothing in his pockets. And for 40 years he had coaxed pomegranates and figs and chili peppers out of ground that everyone in the county had long ago given up on. He had been gone 4 years by then. The farm was hers now, every dry inch of it. And on a Tuesday in late June, with the thermometer on the porch already reading 104 degrees by 10 in the morning, a glossy envelope arrived in the same crooked tin mailbox her grandfather had planted at the end of the lane in 1946. It was not a personal letter. It was a notice, printed on heavy paper that felt cool and slippery in her sun-cracked fingers, the way paper from another world always feels when it lands in your hand on a working farm. It came from a company called Pinnacle Vista Hospitality Group, headquartered somewhere in Southern California, and it spoke in soft, friendly sentences about progress and partnership, and a beautiful new chapter for Hidalgo County. They were going to build a 5-star resort on the 640 acres of old Halverson cattle ground that ran along the northern fence of her property. They were calling it Saguaro Cielo Resort and Spa. The letter promised jobs. The letter promised tax revenue. The letter promised a renaissance for the dying little town of Bowie. Marisol read it twice on the porch, and then she sat down on the wooden step her grandfather had hand-cut from a single mesquite plank in 1952. And she listened. Now here's what you need to understand. She wasn't listening for nothing. She was listening for what she was about to lose. There is a sound to a working desert orchard in the hour after dawn, and it isn't silence. It is the dry chitter of cicadas already starting up in the pomegranate trees. It is the soft tick of split chili pods drying on the racks under the wooden ramada. It is the small papery rattle of fig leaves when the first warm breath of wind comes down off the Chiricahuas, carrying the scent of creosote and hot stone, and last night's coyote tracks. It is the slow, grinding hum of honeybees in the desert willow blossoms, the steady rhythm of her 2 old Nubian goats chewing the way only goats chew, the brass bell on the lead goat's collar making a small, wandering music against the long, flat morning. That sound, all of it layered together, was the music her grandfather had taught her to read when she was 9 years old. The music told her if the bees were working the blossoms right. The music told her if the soil was breathing or choking. The music was the lifeblood of her small business, Quintero Orchards, makers of slow-cooked pomegranate molasses and hand-strung dried chili Marisol, and a small line of southwestern dry spice blends, products that nobody in Bowie had ever heard of, but that chefs in Tucson and Las Cruces and El Paso had begun whispering about by name. She made the molasses in a copper pot her grandfather had brought up from Hermosillo in 1941. The process took 11 hours of low, slow reduction over a wood fire, and it filled the adobe kitchen with a smell so deep and so sweet that her 2 barn cats would sit on the windowsill the whole day and refuse to leave. The dried Marisol she strung by hand on lengths of cotton twine, the way her grandfather had been taught by his own mother in Sonora before 1900, hanging the long red ristras from the rafters of the ramada to cure in the dry desert air for 90 days. A single ristra took her 3 hours of careful work to assemble. She sold maybe 200 of them a year. She was not getting rich. She was not trying to. And the people of Bowie saw it all differently. That's the way of small towns. The folks who gathered on the wooden bench outside Stafford's General Store, the men in straw hats arguing about the Diamondbacks and the women fanning themselves with junk mail, and the boys leaning their bicycles against the storefront. They had been watching that resort plan come for 2 years already, and to them it was salvation walking up the highway. They saw money. They saw their grown children moving back from Phoenix to wait tables and clean rooms and park cars. They saw the railroad town of Bowie, which had lost half its population since the freight line stopped scheduling regular stops in 1978, getting one more chance at being a place that mattered. Old Mrs. Beatriz Aldama, who had known Marisol since she was a barefoot girl in pigtails, took her 2 hands one afternoon by the bins of pinto beans inside Stafford's. "Marisolita," she said in the soft, worried voice of an aunt, "take their money, mija. Buy a nice house in Tucson. Don't kill yourself on that dirt the way your grandfather did. You're young still. You should have a husband, children. There is nothing left here for a girl alone. She meant it as kindness. They all did. They saw a young woman on a hard, dry piece of ground, and they thought they understood exactly what they were looking at. They were certain they did. They were wrong. Marisol folded the letter 4 times and put it in the kitchen drawer where her grandfather had kept his seed packets. She did not cry. She did not call a lawyer. She walked out into the orchard in the long sideways light of evening, and she put her hand on the trunk of the oldest pomegranate tree on the property. A knotted, scarred old grandmother of a tree that her grandfather had planted in 1948. The same year he poured the cement walls of the little adobe office where he kept his journals and his tools and his old Sonoran rifle. She stood there for a long time, listening. She could already hear, faint and far off down the highway, the low growling rumble of a survey truck climbing the grade past her gate. And she could see, behind it, the slow rising dust of 3 more vehicles coming up the dirt road. The world was coming. But that's not what this story is really about. This story is about what her grandfather had buried in those journals, and what a quiet woman with a shovel and 40 years of time can do to a corporation that thinks it owns the wind. In southeastern Arizona, the high desert around Bowie sits at roughly 3,500 feet of elevation, which makes it just cool enough at night to grow stone fruit and pomegranates that would die in the Phoenix lowlands, and just warm enough by day to ripen figs and chili that struggle further north. The dried chili variety called Marisol, Spanish for looking at the sun, grows on upright stems with the pods pointing skyward, which is how it earned its name. Small Mexican-American family orchards have farmed this corner of the state continuously since the 1870s, long before refrigerated trucks made commercial agriculture possible on this scale. And many of the rootstock lines still in use today were carried up from Sonora in burlap and wooden crates by men exactly like Don Esteban Quintero. The soil is alkaline caliche, brutal on a shovel but kind, somehow, to fruit trees that learn to push their roots deep through the cracks in search of the slow underground water that has been there since the last ice age. Part 2. The man in the dark suit arrived 2 months later. Let me describe him to you the way Marisol described him to me years afterward, sitting on that same porch with a tin cup of coffee in her hand and the late afternoon light coming sideways across her face. His name was Brendan Halloway. He was somewhere in his middle 40s with the kind of soft, smooth hands that had never lifted anything heavier than a fountain pen or a coffee cup. He drove a long, white Lincoln Continental down her gravel lane, parked it at an angle that suggested he didn't plan on staying very long, and stepped out wearing a charcoal suit the color of wet asphalt, and a pair of black Oxford shoes that had clearly never touched dirt in their entire short, polished lives. He did not walk up to the porch. He stood beside his car and looked around her property the way a man looks at a coffee stain on a clean shirt, as if her tin-roofed drying ramada and her grandfather's adobe office and her ancient hand pump well were stains on the otherwise pristine landscape he had already drawn up in his head. Marisol came out drying her hands on a faded kitchen towel that had once been red. She did not invite him in. She did not offer him a glass of water in 106-degree heat, which down here is something close to an insult. She just stood at the top of the porch steps and waited. He cleared his throat. "Mrs. Quintero," he said, in a voice as smooth and practiced as polished granite. "I'm Brendan Halloway. I'm the Director of Land Acquisitions for Pinnacle Vista. I'm sure you can see the obvious incompatibility between your operation and the kind of guest experience we're designing here." He gestured loosely toward her sheds, her sun-faded laundry line, the goats grazing in the side pasture. "Our clientele will be paying significant sums for tranquility, mountain views, dark night skies, and a curated southwestern aesthetic. A working agricultural property, however charming it might appear to you, doesn't quite fit that particular picture." Marisol said nothing for a long count of breaths. She had seen men like him before, in old black and white photographs in her grandfather's wooden box of papers. Men in suits standing beside surveyors' transits, drawing lines on maps. Men who thought the world was something you could redraw with a pencil and the right amount of money. Halloway misread her silence for shyness, the way men like him often misread the silence of women like her. And so he kept going. He told her Pinnacle Vista was prepared to make her an extraordinarily generous offer. Then he said a number. The number was $820,000. It was a great deal of money. It was, in fact, more money than the entire town of Bowie generated in property tax revenue in a single year. It was enough to buy 3 houses in Tucson and live without working for the rest of her natural life. Marisol let the number hang there in the dry air between them. Then she answered him, very quietly, in the slight Sonoran accent her grandfather had given her like an inheritance. La tierra no se vende, Señor Holloway. The land is not for sale. He smiled then, a small, tight smile, the kind a man gives when he has not yet been told no by anyone who mattered. Mrs. Quintero, you may not fully understand what's about to happen out here over the next 18 months. There will be blasting for the foundations. There will be heavy machinery operating 14 hours a day. There will be dust, vibration, noise carrying for miles. It is, frankly, not going to be a hospitable environment for an agricultural operation. I'd encourage you to think very carefully before you turn down what is, I assure you, a one-time offer. Marisol nodded slowly, the way her grandfather used to nod at men who explained things to him about his own land. I understand perfectly, Mr. Holloway. The land is not for sale. He looked at her for a long moment. The desert breeze moved his expensive tie. Then he gave a small, tight nod and walked back to his Lincoln. He was certain, getting into that car and starting the engine, that she would call him by Christmas. He was wrong about that too. He was wrong about almost everything. And here's what you need to understand about what came next. He had been honest about the disruption. That was the only honest thing he said. 6 months later, in the dry cold of February 1990, the blasting began. The contractors were grading the slope to the north of her fence line to build the resort's golf course. And to get the lay of the land right, they had to dynamite the volcanic hardpan that ran just under the surface like a buried sheet of fired clay. The first blast went off on a Tuesday morning at 7:15. Marisol was in her kitchen pouring coffee from the same enamel pot her grandfather had bought in 1950. The whole house shook. 3 glass jars of last summer's pomegranate molasses slid off her pantry shelf and broke on the tile floor in 3 small red explosions. Out in the side pasture, her 4 Nubian goats took off in a blind panic and ran into the fence, and the lead doe, a 6-year-old gentle animal named Estrella, cut her leg open badly enough that Marisol had to stitch the wound herself by lamplight with veterinary sutures her grandfather had stockpiled in 1968. In the orchard, a slow, soft cloud of pale caliche dust began to settle on the new green leaves of her pomegranate trees. The trees that her grandfather had grafted in 1961 from rootstock he had carried up himself in a wooden crate from a village outside Hermosillo. The blasting went on for 14 months. The dust never went away. Every leaf in her orchard wore a fine, pale film of caliche, and the chili pods drying on the Ramada racks, the Marisol pods that should have ripened a deep, glossy red-brown with a sharp, peppery scent like old leather and dried fruit, instead came down dull and powdery and tasting faintly of cement. She lost the orders from 2 of her 3 Tucson restaurants that first spring. The chefs were polite about it. They said the product just wasn't the same this year. They asked if everything was all right. She told them everything was fine. She did not tell them about the resort. Her honey production collapsed next. The bees needed the morning dew on the orchard flowers, and the dew now carried construction dust into every drop of honey they brought back to the hives. Whole colonies went silent over the course of one long, strange spring. She would lift the lid off a hive that had been thriving the year before and find nothing but a few stunned, confused bees and the empty geometry of the wax. Then the nights got worse. The construction company put up 6 enormous halogen flood lamps along the ridge for worker safety during night pours. They wrote on the county permit application. The lights ran from sundown to sunup, and they bled across the ridge into her valley and turned her nights into a sour, artificial twilight that did not belong on any farm. The lesser long-nosed bats that had pollinated her saguaros, and her agave, and her old fig trees for 40 years. The bats that came up in waves from the Mexican border every May with their soft brown bellies and their long pointed snouts and their soundless flight. They did not come the next year. They followed the dark. The dark had moved on. By the end of 1991, her pomegranate harvest was down by a third. Her honey was nearly gone. Her chili crop tasted of nothing at all. And she had cried exactly twice. Once when she found the first empty hive, and once when she realized the bats were not coming back. And that's when everything changed. The cement fine dust kicked up by desert construction is mostly powdered caliche, calcium carbonate hardpan that forms over thousands of years beneath the Arizona surface. When it coats fruit tree leaves, it blocks the small openings called stomata that the leaves use to exchange gases and regulate moisture, which slowly suffocates the tree and lowers fruit sugar over time. Lesser long-nosed bats migrate through southeastern Arizona every summer to pollinate columnar cacti and night-blooming desert plants, and they navigate primarily by smell and by very low ambient light. Artificial floodlighting disrupts their feeding routes and causes whole colonies to abandon territory they have used for generations. None of this was in the resort's environmental impact statement, because none of it was required to be. Part 3. Now let me tell you about her grandfather, because none of what comes next makes any kind of sense without him. Don Esteban Quintero was born in 1896 in a small mountain village in the Mexican state of Sonora, in the foothills south of a town called Cananea. He grew up herding sheep for a wealthy landowner who paid him in cornmeal and old blankets. He could neither read nor write Spanish until he was 19 years old, when a Jesuit priest passing through the village taught him his letters in exchange for help fixing a stone wall. He came across the border in 1930 during the troubles of the Cristero War, on foot, with nothing in his pockets but a wool blanket and a small canvas bag of pomegranate seeds his mother had pressed into his hands the morning he left. He was 34 years old, the same age Marisol would be when the letter came 60 years later. He worked the rail yards in Douglas for 8 years, swinging a sledge and laying ballast, and he saved every dollar he could in a coffee can buried under the floorboards of a rented room. Then in 1938, he bought 120 acres of abandoned ranch ground outside Bowie from a widow for $1,400 cash. And he started planting. He never took a loan in his life. Not one. Det mija, he used to say to a small Marisol, with his rough hand on her head, is a rope you twist for yourself. They give you the hemp and the knife, but you are the one who ties the knot and puts it around your own neck. He taught her to read the land the way other grandfathers teach chess or fishing. He taught her to look at the way the morning dust settled on a pomegranate leaf and know whether the tree was thirsty. He taught her to taste a single dried chili pod and tell what month it had been picked and what kind of summer it had grown through. He taught her to listen to the way the wind came down off the Chiricahuas in late August and know whether the monsoon was going to break that week or the next. He taught her to feel the soil in her two hands and know, just from the way it crumbled, whether it wanted figs or pomegranates or beans that year. He taught her to find north by the way the lichen grew on the rocks. He taught her how to read the eyes of a sick goat and know exactly what was wrong. But the most important thing he taught her was about boundaries, not the kind made of barbed wire and steel posts. He didn't believe in those much. He believed in living boundaries. Marisolita, he told her one slow evening when she was about 11, while they were patching a stone wall together as the sun went down behind the orchard. The world will always push at you. It will always want a piece of what you have, and it will not stop wanting. You cannot build a fence tall enough to stop it. They will come over it, or under it, or around it, but you can plant one, a line of trees, mija. It is a patient defense. It feeds the birds. It holds the soil through the monsoon. It softens the wind. It cools the air. It doesn't fight the world. It just persuades the world to walk around. She had nodded the way a child nods at things she does not yet understand. She remembered, though. She remembered everything he ever said. After the blasting started and the bats stopped coming and her honey collapsed, she went looking. There was a small adobe room behind the main house that her grandfather had used as his office and his workshop, with thick saman walls that kept the inside cool even in the deep August heat. On the shelves were his journals. He had kept them since 1936. They were thick leather-bound ledgers from a stationery store in Douglas, and they were full of his careful blocky Spanish handwriting in pencil and in ink. Ledgers of rainfall, planting dates, breeding records for his goats, notes on the behavior of the wild bees, observations about the mountains, sketches of clouds, drawings of bird nests, the dates of every hard freeze going back 55 years. She pulled them down, one volume at a time, and read them by the yellow light of a kerosene lamp because she did not want to run the electric bill any higher than she had to that month. And in the journal marked 1962, on a Wednesday in March, she found it. It was 13 pages long. It was titled, in his careful blocky Spanish handwriting, Defensa Verde, Green defense. He had written it the year the state of Arizona first announced plans to widen Highway 10, which at the time would have run a noisy 4-lane within 2 miles of his orchard, and trucked diesel exhaust into his pomegranate bloom every spring. The highway plan had eventually moved further north, but he had finished the design anyway, because, he wrote in the margin in his slow, careful pencil, "Una pared verde serves siempre." A green wall always serves. The design was a layered windbreak and noise barrier made entirely of native and adapted desert trees, arranged in a precise stepped pattern that he had worked out by hand. The outermost row was velvet mesquite, fast-growing, deep-rooted, and tough as iron, planted at 12-foot spacing for a quick first screen within 5 years. Behind that, a denser second row of desert willow and Texas mountain laurel, planted close, 8-foot spacing, to build mass and slow the wind. Behind that, a third row of slow-growing Arizona sycamore and southern live oak, planted at 20-foot spacing, for the long permanence that would outlive him and her both. And between every row, low understory of creosote and jojoba and brittlebush, packed tight, to absorb sound at the lower frequencies and to hold the soil against the violence of the summer monsoon runoff. He had calculated everything. The spacing was staggered so that the prevailing northwest wind from the Chiricahua Gap would hit the wall at a quartering angle and be forced upward and outward, instead of punching straight through. He had estimated water needs in gallons per tree per week for the first 3 years, and then declining after that as the deep roots took hold and tapped the water table at 32 feet. He had drawn it all out on graph paper in his slow, careful hand, with neat little circles for the trees and small arrows for the wind, and tiny dots for the understory shrubs. He had even noted the best months to plant each species: mesquite in the cool weeks of November, sycamore in the soft, warming days of late February, to give every sapling the best possible first season. At the bottom of the last page, in soft pencil, he had written one sentence: "Si plantas hoy, tus nietos viven en paz." If you plant today, your grandchildren live in peace. Marisol sat in that small adobe room until the kerosene lamp burned low and the wick began to smoke. She thought about how the experts on the resort side, the surveyors with their tripods, the lawyers with their briefcases, the developers with their satellite photographs, saw nothing but acreage and zoning lines and elevations and the angle of the afternoon sun. She thought about how the people in Bowie saw nothing but a stubborn young woman on a dying piece of dirt. They all saw the problem. She, holding her grandfather's journal in her 2 hands, saw the answer. And the answer was going to be ridiculous to everyone who looked at it. It was going to require no money to speak of, no lawyer, no fight, no protest sign, no letter to the editor of the Tucson newspaper. It was going to require, instead, the one resource her grandfather had taught her to spend freely: time. Years of it. 20 years, maybe. 30. Years she had because she was 34, and the land was patient, and so was she. She closed the journal. She walked out into the warm dark of the desert night, and she could hear, faint over the ridge, the low diesel hum of the construction company's overnight generators running their floodlights. She smiled, just a little, in the dark. They were on their schedule. She was on hers. The kind of layered windbreak Don Esteban drew up has roots in much older agricultural practice. In the American Great Plains, the Civilian Conservation Corps planted nearly 200 million trees as multi-row shelter belts between 1935 and 1942 to combat the Dust Bowl, using a similar step design of fast outer trees and slow inner hardwoods. The technique works because a solid wall creates damaging turbulence on the leeward side, while a permeable living wall slows wind smoothly across a distance of up to 30 times the height of the trees. A mature multi-row mesquite and oak windbreak in southern Arizona can reduce measured wind speed by 60 to 70% and ambient sound by 10 to 15 decibels. Part 4. Let me tell you what it cost her. That fall, in October of 1992, Marisol drove her grandfather's faded blue 1978 Chevrolet pickup to a small nursery in Wilcox, 41 miles north up the highway. She had saved up. She had scraped together. She had sold 2 of her 4 goats and a hand-tooled leather saddle that had belonged to her grandfather, which a horse breeder from Cochise paid her $640 for after some careful negotiation. With the money, she bought 420 saplings: velvet mesquite, desert willow, Texas mountain laurel, Arizona sycamore, southern live oak. The trees were thin as her little finger. The nursery owner, an older man named Hollis Pruitt, who had known Don Esteban 30 years before, and who still remembered the first time her grandfather had walked into his nursery in 1960 asking for fig rootstock, helped her load them into the truck bed wrapped in damp burlap. He looked at her for a long moment before he closed the tailgate. "That's an awful lot of trees for one woman, Marisol." She just nodded. "I have time, Hollis." He didn't ask what they were for. He had known her grandfather. He knew the Quintero family did not waste words and did not explain themselves to people who hadn't earned it. The first hole took her 1 hour and 17 minutes to dig. She timed it on her grandfather's old wind-up wristwatch, the one she still wore on a leather strap that had been resized for her wrist. The caliche under the topsoil was like trying to chip through fired pottery. Hard and brittle and unforgiving. She used a pickaxe and a long-handled shovel and a small iron pry bar her grandfather had hammered out himself in 1944 on an anvil he'd traded a goat for. She got blisters on the second day that broke and bled into her work gloves and stuck the leather to her palms when she pulled them off at night. By the end of the first week, her hands were ruined. By the end of the second week, they were starting to remember how to be hands again, with new pads of callus building up under the old skin. Her water came from her own well, hauled in 5-gallon plastic jerrycans from the pump to the planting line in the bed of the truck, one canister giving 4 trees a deep first drink. She started before sunrise when the temperature was still in the 70s, and the air still smelled faintly of last night's coolness. By 11 in the morning, when the thermometer began to climb past 95, she would retreat into the deep shade of the ramada and rest, and drink water with a pinch of salt in it, the way her grandfather had taught her to drink water in the desert when she was 8 years old. Then she would go out again at 4 in the afternoon and work until the light failed and the bats came out. The few bats that still came, hunting moths in the lavender air. Her neighbor to the west, Joaquin Reyes, who ran cattle on 600 acres of dry range and had known the family since he was a boy, rode his quarter horse over one Saturday in the 3rd week to see what she was doing. He sat his horse at the fence line with his palm resting on the pommel and watched her dig for 10 minutes without saying anything. Then he leaned forward in the saddle and said, "Marisol, in that soil, mija, those trees will be waist high in 10 years. You know that, right? Maybe not even that." She looked up at him from the bottom of a half-dug hole, sweat running down the sides of her face in 2 clean streaks through the caliche dust. And she said, "I know, Joaquin. I am not in a hurry." He shook his head slowly. He sat there another moment looking at her. Then he turned the horse and rode home. By the time he got back to his own ranch and told his wife Lupe about it over their evening meal, the story was already moving through Bowie. Marisol Quintero had finally cracked. The Quintero girl was out there planting a forest in the desert by herself with a pickaxe. La pobre, la loca. They felt sorry for her. Some of them, the kinder ones, prayed for her at Mass on Sunday. Most of them just shook their heads and changed the subject when her name came up. The construction across the ridge thundered on through that whole first winter and into the spring of 1993. They were pouring the resort's main lodge foundations now, and the concrete mixers came up the highway at 2:30 in the morning to beat the daytime heat. And their downshifting diesel engines and their reverse beepers, and the steady metronomic chunking of the rotating drums carried for miles in the still desert air. Marisol kept digging. She kept hauling water. She kept setting saplings into holes and tamping the dirt around them with the heel of her boot the way her grandfather had taught her, firm enough to hold the tree upright but loose enough to let the new roots breathe. Her shoulders ached so badly some nights she could not lift a coffee cup with her right hand and had to use her left. Her bank balance by Christmas of that year was $283.42. She was 36 years old now. She had no husband, no children, no employees, no help of any kind, and an unbroken line of pencil-thin trees marching along her northern fence in a pattern that, from any reasonable distance on the highway, looked exactly like nothing at all. Now here's the part I want you to understand. There was a night in February of 1993, a cold, wet night. The kind of cold that only happens in the high desert when a Pacific storm pushes inland and the temperature drops to 34 degrees and the air feels wetter than it has any right to feel in Arizona. Marisol had been working in the rain all day, planting the last of that month's batch of mountain laurel saplings, pushing through because the trees had been sitting in the back of the truck for 48 hours, and she could not afford to lose them. Her boots were soaked through to the wool socks. Her hands were so cold she could not feel the shovel handle, and had wrapped them in 2 old kitchen towels for the last hour of work. When she came in at dark, she sat down on the wooden floor of the adobe office with her back against the cool salmon wall, and she did not get up for a long time. Across the ridge, through the small high window, she could see the lights of the half-finished resort lodge, already a glass and steel monument, lit up like a cathedral against the wet desert night, with the construction floodlights running on their diesel generators that she could faintly hear even from inside her own walls. They had built that whole thing in the time she had dug. What? Maybe 160 holes? 200? She put her wet face in her wet hands. For the first time, she let herself think about Mr. Halloway's $820,000. She thought about a small, clean apartment in Tucson, with central air conditioning and tile floors, and a dishwasher and no goats and no caliche under her fingernails. She thought about being warm. She thought about, for the first time in years, the possibility of meeting a man and having a child, and living a normal woman's life somewhere where the world did not press on her every single day. She thought very clearly, the thought she had not let herself think since the letter arrived almost 4 years before. Maybe they were right. Maybe she was a fool. Maybe her grandfather had been a stubborn, beautiful old man who had wasted his whole life on a piece of dirt that did not love him back. And maybe she was about to do the same thing for the same reason, just because he had done it first, and she did not know how to be the one who broke the line. Then she remembered his hands. The deep cracks across his knuckles, the white scars from mesquite thorns going back 50 years, the caliche dust permanently ground into the lines of his palms so that even Sunday morning soap could not lift it out. He had buried a brother in 1958, killed by a rattlesnake in his own back orchard. He had survived the 1952 drought that emptied half the county. He had buried his wife, Marisol's grandmother, in 1970 of a heart attack at 58, and he had not sold 1 acre. Not one. She got up off the floor. She made a cup of coffee. She put on dry socks. She went to bed. The next morning, she went back out and dug another hole. The doubt did not come back. Not ever. The psychological pattern of long arc work, the kind of project that requires years of daily effort before producing any visible results, is something agricultural researchers and behavioral psychologists have studied for decades. The most reliable predictor of completion is not motivation or willpower, but inherited modeling. People who watched a parent or grandparent finish a multi-decade project are far more likely to finish one themselves. They have an internal sense of how slow real progress feels, and they don't mistake the slowness for failure. It's one of the strongest cultural advantages of multi-generational family farms, and one of the hardest things to teach in a single lifetime. Part 5. The resort opened in July of 1996. They held a big ceremony with the governor of Arizona, and a country music singer flown in from Nashville, and a fireworks display that could be seen from Lordsburg in New Mexico. And the local paper out of Tucson put it on the front page for 3 days running. Saguaro Cielo Resort and Spa. 240 rooms, 2 swimming pools, both shaped like saguaro cacti when viewed from a helicopter. An 18-hole golf course called Coyote Run, designed by a famous course architect from Scottsdale, who had also done work in Hawaii and at Pebble Beach. A spa with mud baths and a hot stone room, and a Sonoran-themed eucalyptus steam chamber. And for the wealthier guests, a fleet of 3 small Bell helicopters that ran scenic tours over the Chiricahua Mountains at $290 per seat, lifting off twice a day from a concrete helipad just inside the property line. From the brand new lobby of the resort, the view to the south was supposed to be unbroken high desert running all the way to the Mexican border. The kind of view that justified the room rates. It mostly was, except for one slightly odd thing. Right along the south fence of their property, blocking part of what should have been the postcard view, was a dense, low, dusty green wall of trees, 4 years tall, already taller than a tall man could reach. Behind that wall, on the other side, the world had quietly changed. Marisol's velvet mesquites had shot up faster than anyone in Hidalgo County would have believed. The way mesquite does once its deep taproot finally finds water in the 2nd or 3rd year. Her desert willows were blooming pink and lavender in the spring and the fall, drawing back the hummingbirds and the carpenter bees in clouds. Her young sycamores and live oaks were still small, but they were alive, and they would be there in 80 years. The wall already stood between 15 and 22 feet tall along most of its length, depending on the species and the soil under each section. The construction side floodlights still ran at night for the resort's parking areas and the service entrances, but their hard light now had to filter through 1,000 small leaves before it crossed onto her ground. And what reached her orchard was a soft, second-hand glow, no harsher than a full moon on a clear night. The blasting had been done for 2 years. The concrete mixers were gone. The night was the night again, the way her grandfather had known it. And on her side of the wall, the bats came back. The lesser long-nosed bats with their soft brown bellies and their long pointed snouts came back the spring of 1995 and pollinated her old grandmother fig tree and the wild agave along her south property line. And her honeybees followed them back into a sky that smelled right again. And her honey came back rich and dark and floral and complex. The pomegranates ripened that fall to a sugar content she had not seen since her grandfather was alive. And the dried chili Marisol she pulled off the Ramada racks in October smelled finely of dried fruit and old leather and sunlight on stone, the way it was supposed to smell. She sold those products from a small wooden stand at the end of her gravel lane. The stand her grandfather had built in 1964 out of mesquite boards he cut himself. There was a tin coffee can on the stand for the money, and a small chalkboard with prices written in her careful handwriting, and no person standing there at all. People left their money. They mostly did anyway. Once or twice a year somebody would take a jar without paying, and Marisol would not say a word about it. Her income from the stand and from a handful of restaurant accounts in Tucson and Las Cruces that had stayed loyal through the bad years was modest. She paid her property taxes on time. She kept the old truck running. She fed herself and her 2 remaining goats and her 3 barn cats. She had no debt of any kind. She was, in the way her grandfather had defined the word, free. And then one afternoon in late September of 1998, a silver rental car pulled up to her stand. A woman got out. She was somewhere in her early 50s, lean as a desert hawk, with steel gray hair pulled back in a silver clip, wearing a cream linen jacket and a pair of expensive sandals that nobody in Bowie had ever owned. She walked slowly around the stand. She picked up a jar of pomegranate molasses and held it up to the late afternoon sun and watched the deep red light go through the glass. She smelled the cork. She bought 1 jar and 1 small braid of dried Marisol and a small bag of southwestern dry spice blend. She put a $20 bill in the coffee can. She took a long, slow breath of the air over the orchard, the warm smell of fig and mesquite smoke and dust and late summer pomegranate. Then she got back in her car and drove away. Marisol, watching from the porch 100 yards off, did not think much of it. People came down the lane sometimes. Sometimes they came looking for directions. Sometimes they came looking for a piece of the desert they could not name. The woman's name, though Marisol would not learn it for another 4 months, was Catherine Devereaux. She wrote about food for the San Francisco Chronicle, and her syndicated column ran in 27 newspapers across the country, including the Los Angeles Times and the Chicago Tribune, and the New York Times Sunday food section. 4 months later, in late January of 1999, the article came out. Marisol's mailman, an older fellow named Albert Boudreau, who had been delivering on that rural route for 19 years and who had known her grandfather and had been at his funeral, brought her a folded clipping along with the bills and the seed catalogs. He had cut it out himself with kitchen scissors and folded it into a square the night before. He handed it to her at the gate with a small, proud smile crossing his lined, sun-weathered face. "Marisol," he said, "you are famous." The piece was 2 full pages with a color photograph of her dusty wooden stand at the end of the lane, and a smaller black and white shot of a jar of her molasses caught in slanting evening light. Devereaux had written about Saguaro Cielo first, the new pools, the celebrity French chef, the truffle oils flown in twice a month from Italy, the Sonoran Desert tasting menu that cost $170 a person before wine. She had described all of it with the clean, polished, surgical contempt of a woman who had eaten in 300 resort restaurants and could no longer taste any of them, who had finally gotten tired of being served the same 6 expensive ingredients arranged on different colored plates. And then she had described Marisol's pomegranate molasses. She had written that 1 spoonful of it tasted, in her exact words, like a concentrated Sonoran sunset poured slowly into a small glass jar. She had written about the dried chili Marisol that it carried the smell of 40 years of wind crossing 40 years of orchard. She had written that just down the road from the most expensive resort in southern Arizona, in a coffee can at the end of a dirt lane in a town nobody had heard of. She had found something the resort with its $10,000 suites, and its 3 helicopters, and its imported French chef could not buy with all the money it had ever made. And here is the part that matters. Within 2 weeks of the article appearing, the resort concierge's desk began getting requests. Quiet at first. A guest at breakfast asking the waiter where they could find that pomegranate molasses from the magazine article. Then a couple at dinner asking if the kitchen used the local chili from the orchard down the road. Then more. Then a lot more. Then 30 requests in a single weekend. The resort's executive chef, a Frenchman named Pascal Lemieux, flown in from a 5-star hotel in Los Angeles on a contract that paid him $300,000 a year, was forced to tell guest after guest that no. The resort served imported French goat cheese and Italian olive oil and Sicilian sea salt, but it did not at present carry any products from Quintero orchards. The guests were not impressed. The guests were paying $10,000 a night for the desert, and they wanted the desert on the plate, not a different desert flown in from Provence. And the only desert anyone could taste, it turned out, was just over the ridge, behind a wall of trees that the resort architects had never even noticed when they drew up the floor plans. The mechanism by which a single piece of food writing can transform a small producer's business is sometimes called the prestige cascade. A trusted critic establishes authenticity from outside the local market, which gives the product social permission to be valuable to wealthy consumers who do not have the cultural background to judge it themselves. The same loaf of bread, the same wheel of cheese, the same bottle of olive oil can sit ignored on a roadside stand for a decade and then become impossible to keep in stock within a single news cycle. The product has not changed. What has changed is who is allowed, in the eyes of the market, to say that it is good. Part 6. Mr. Brendan Halloway drove back down her gravel lane in the spring of 1999. It had been almost 10 years since he had stood by his white Lincoln and offered her $820,000. He drove a different car this time, a newer black German sedan, and he looked, when he stepped out of it, like a man who had not been sleeping well. There was gray now at his temples. The smooth confidence in his shoulders was gone, replaced by a careful weariness. He walked all the way up her gravel lane to the porch, slowly, with the careful step of a man who had finally remembered that he was on someone else's ground. Marisol was sitting on the porch in her grandfather's old slat-back chair, her hands working through a tray of dried chili pods, separating the cracked ones from the whole ones the way her mother had taught her when she was 6. She did not stand. She did not look up. Halloway stopped at the bottom of the porch steps. "Mrs. Quintero," he said. She let him stand there for what was probably 20 seconds. The desert wind moved the wind chimes her grandfather had made out of old copper tubing in 1953. A goat called from the side pasture. Then she set the tray down beside her chair and looked at him with her grandfather's level brown eyes. "Mr. Halloway." He cleared his throat. He had clearly been practicing what he was going to say in the car all the way down. But standing there in the white afternoon light, the words did not come out the way he had rehearsed them. "Mrs. Quintero, we have a supply situation. Our guests have developed a very specific interest in your products. Our chef has been receiving complaints. We would like to discuss the possibility of you supplying the resort restaurants and gift shop on an exclusive basis." Marisol did not answer immediately. She picked up a single dried Marisol pod, looked at it, ran her thumb along its papery side, and placed it carefully into the basket of whole pods. The small dry sound it made was, for a long moment, the only sound on the porch. "That is interesting," she said finally. "I seem to recall, Mr. Halloway, that my farm was incompatible with your vision. I believe that was the word you used standing right where you're standing now, almost 10 years ago this June. Incompatible." He had the grace to flush. The color came up his neck above the white collar. "Our vision has evolved. We now see real value in a more authentic farm-to-table component to our guest experience. The market has shifted." She nodded slowly. "I see. The market has shifted." She stood up. She wiped her hands on the front of her apron. "I am willing to discuss a proposal, Mr. Halloway. My lawyer will be in touch with your office to arrange a meeting." And then she picked up the tray and walked into the house and closed the screen door gently behind her. He stood on the gravel below the porch for another full minute before he turned and walked back to his car. The meeting happened a week later. It did not happen in a glass office tower in Phoenix. It happened at Marisol's kitchen table on a Tuesday morning in May, with the screen door propped open and a cool morning breeze moving through the adobe. Mr. Holloway came with two corporate lawyers from Los Angeles in dark suits whose names Marisol did not bother to remember. She had her own lawyer beside her, a quiet, methodical man named Rodrigo Salcido from the county seat in Wilcox, who wore a brown jacket and a bolo tie and had handled estate matters for half the small Mexican-American farms in Hidalgo County for 25 years. Marisol served them coffee in thick ceramic mugs and put a small plate of dried figs and a jar of her own pomegranate molasses on the table, along with a wooden spoon. The lawyers from Los Angeles did not touch any of it. Holloway, after a long moment, did. He spread a small, careful taste on a fig. Marisol watched him taste it. She did not smile. She let Mr. Salcido do most of the speaking, but every term was hers, and she had thought about each one of them for 10 years while she was digging holes in caliche and hauling water in 5-gallon cans. She set the price for her pomegranate molasses and her dried Marisol. It was not a wholesale price. It was full retail plus a delivery fee. She set the volume, a fixed amount per week. No more, no less. If the resort wanted more than she could produce without stressing her trees or her land or her own 2 aging hands, they could learn to live with the limit. Then came the part that mattered most. She demanded an exclusivity clause that ran both ways. Saguaro Tielo would be her only commercial client. And in return, the resort could not stock or serve any other pomegranate molasses, any other dried chili of any variety, any other artisan honey, from any other producer, anywhere, for as long as the contract existed. If their guests wanted what the magazine had described, they would get it from her, and only from her. There was one more term, and Mr. Salcido slid a hand-drawn map of her property across the kitchen table. Around her 120 acres, drawn in red ink, was a 2-mile buffer circle. The flight paths of the resort's scenic helicopter tours, he said quietly, will no longer cross this line. The noise is disruptive to my client's livestock and her business operations. The corporate lawyers from Los Angeles began to bluster about FAA regulations and federal airspace. Marisol let them talk. She drank her coffee slowly. When they were finished, she looked directly at Mr. Holloway. "Those are my terms," she said. "All of them, or none of them." He looked at her. He looked through her kitchen window, at the thriving orchard outside, at the dense green wall on the ridge that had not been there when he first drove down her lane. He had tried to erase her. Instead, she had become essential to everything he had built. He picked up the pen. "We will sign," he said. And then, more to himself than to anyone else, "The long view is always the clearest." 22 years passed. The contract held. The resort changed corporate hands twice, but the Quintero Orchard Supply Agreement, with its exclusivity clause and its 2-mile helicopter buffer, became a permanent feature of the property, a fixed reality that new general managers were briefed on in their first week. Over time, the resort's own marketing began to lean on the story, advertising what it now called an iconic partnership with the Quintero family farm. Marisol found a quiet, deep satisfaction in the irony. They had tried to bulldoze her, and now they were selling her as the soul of the place. She never expanded. That had never been the point. She used the income to buy 180 acres of adjacent mesquite scrubland and place it into a permanent conservation easement, so nothing could ever be built on her borders again. The green wall her grandfather had drawn in 1962 grew, over the decades, into a true mature desert grove. Elf owls came back. Vermilion flycatchers nested in the live oaks every May. The dense canopy now stood 35 feet tall, and you could no longer see the resort from her orchard at all. Young farmers began to find their way down her gravel lane. They came from Pima County and Cochise County, from across the line in New Mexico, sometimes from as far as the Imperial Valley in California. They came not to ask how to grow bigger. They came to ask how to stay small, how to hold ground against money. Marisol would walk them along the edge of her property in the green shade of the wall, and she would tell them, in the quiet voice that had become her grandfather's voice in her, "The world will always push at you. It will offer you money to go away. It will make noise and dust to scare you away. Most people believe the only 2 choices are to fight or to run." She would put her hand on the rough bark of a 40-year-old velvet mesquite that her own hands had set into the ground when she was 36. "But there is a third way, mija. You can plant. You can build something quiet and alive. You can give the land a chance to defend itself. It takes a long time. It takes work you do not believe you can finish. But in the end, what is patient outlasts what is merely strong. One cool morning in the early autumn of 2021, when Marisol was 64 years old and her hair had gone the silver color of old mesquite ash, she stood in the small adobe office with her grandnephew Tomas. He was 21 years old, just back from 2 years at the agricultural college in Las Cruces, and he had her grandfather's same quiet brown eyes and his same long, careful hands. She lifted the leather-bound 1962 journal from the shelf where it had lived for almost 60 years. The leather had gone soft as cloth. The corners were worn round. The spine was cracked in 2 places. She placed it gently in his hands. "Esta es tuya ahora, mijo," she said in her grandfather's slow, Sonoran Spanish. "This is yours now. It knows more than I do. Listen to it, and listen to the land. They will never steer you wrong." The men in suits, all those years ago, had told her the farm had to go because it was incompatible with their vision of what this corner of Arizona was supposed to be. They had been wrong. She had kept the farm. She had kept her grandfather's wisdom. And in the end, it was the world that had to change its vision to become compatible with hers. A conservation easement is a permanent legal restriction placed on a piece of land that prevents certain kinds of development, usually subdivision, mining, or commercial construction, while allowing the owner to continue ranching, farming, or simple stewardship. Easements run with the land, meaning they bind every future owner, not just the one who signs the original document. Since the late 1970s, more than 38 million acres of American farmland and ranchland have been placed into permanent conservation easements, much of it by small family operators who watched their neighbors sell out and decided that whatever they had been left was in the end more important than any one generation's right to cash out.